So, good morning, students. Today I'm going to talk about this lecture, which is on expenditure, public expenditure. Public expenditure, we have many theories on public expenditure, particularly Musgrave's understanding as well as uh, Wiseman Peacock hypothesis, Wegener, etc. So, many people had talked about the expenditure mechanism under public expenditure framework. So what we are going to be in talking about today is actually a very brief lecture, and it won't be a very big one. It's a small lecture about different expenditure pattern and mechanism. So the first one is actually, I think all of you are familiar with, which is called the Adolf Wagner's law of increasing state activity. So let me start with the introduction of the author. This is a proposition which is made by Adolf Wagner, who is a German economist, made an in-depth study relating to the rise of government expenditure in the late 19th century. And he come up with some interesting, striking results. In fact, he was talked about. It is because of the state's size increases, therefore the expenditure is also, or the growth of the state is also matters for the expenditure. So this is what is, in a nutshell, he was trying to propose. He propounded a law called the law of increasing state activity. So Wagner's law states that as the economy develops over time, the activity and function of the government increases. So very simple. There is a positive correlation between the state's development as well as the expenditure of the government. So according to Wagner, a comprehensive comparison of different countries and different time show that among progressive people societies which allow Oh, sorry, which alone we are concerned, and increasing regularly take increasing increase in spending that is regularly take place. The activity of both central government and local government constantly undertaking new functions while they perform both old and new functions more efficiently and more completely. In this way, economic needs of the people to an increasing extent and in a more satisfactory fashion are satisfied by the central and local government. Now, this theory, this is what is called a law because why? Because it is almost true with almost all the countries in the world, whether in the earlier phase of the expenditure of the state or the newer phase of the expenditure of the state, or irrespective of whether the country's origin or extent or kind of their texture, etc., all that is in fact validate this point that when the country is moving towards a higher development or an improvement in social and economic condition, then the spending of the state in terms of the government expenditure is also increases. So that is why this is called a law. Okay, in distributor kind of situation. So Wagner's statement indicates, in that sense, in progressive societies, the activities of the central and the local government increase on a regular basis. So the increase in the government activities is both extensive and intensive in that sense. So the governments undertake new function in the interest of the society. The old and new functions are performed more efficiently and completely than before. The purpose of the government activity is to meet the economic needs of the people in that sense. So the expansion and intensification of the government function and activities led to increase in public expenditures. Though Wagner studied the economic growth of Germany, it applies to other countries too, both developed and developing countries. So this is what is actually the kind of found finding which Wagner's was put forth in 19th century itself. So the criticism goes like this: that the principal criticism of Wagner's law have concerned his view of history and of the relationship between the state and the citizens. So Peacock and Wiseman also queried whether Wagner's idea could be applied to whole society to whole time, and suggested that the time pattern of an actual public expenditure growth did not fit well with Wagner's law. But this is only a technical criticism as far as the law is concerned. So let us go to the technicality of what Peacock Wiesman had put forth. So let us talk about what is their finding. And Peacock and Wiesman conducted a new study based on Wagner's law. They studied the public expenditure from 1891 to 1955. They found out that Wagner's law is still valid. The first point is that the law is actually the proposed positive relationship between the expenditure of public, uh, that is government expenditure, as well as the growth of the economy. That positive correlation still persists. But the only difference which they found out is that the following, that is, the rise in public expenditure greatly depend on revenue collection. So over the years, economic development results in substantial revenue to the government. This enables to increase public expenditure. For example, the development of the state itself come from a sort of collection of income. So if you have more and more tapping of income, or that means if you have more and more mechanism which entitles the state to get more income, then that kind of a collection, which is in fact leads to a higher spending in that sense. Why this statement is valid, that if that has been curtailed, then the spending of the state can be also questioned. So there exists a big gap between the expectation of the people about public expenditure and the tolerance level of taxation. Therefore, the government cannot ignore the demand made by people regarding various services, especially when the revenue collection is increasing at the constant rate of taxation. So this is the second point which they try to emphasize on. So they further stated that during the time of war, the government further increases the tax rate and enlarges the tax structure to generate more funds to meet the increase in defense expenditure. After the war, the new tax rate and tax structure remain the same as people get used to them. Therefore, the increase in revenue results in rising government expenditure in total. Because you any longer, concentrate on the spending of the, military or the defense expenditure, but still you have income. Therefore, you try to spend on other sector, which again, kind of, give you better spending rooms in that sense. So Wigner's law and Peacock-Wiseman hypothesis emphasize on the fact that public expenditure has tendency to increase over time. So, irrespective of this criticism, which is from technical ground or which is on the functional ground, the initial proposition of Wagner's law hold. That is what is called the Wagner's law. Otherwise, we could have called it as a proposition. But it is empirically, it is proved that all this is true. Theoretically, not necessary, but when you, because it is also coincides with the earlier understanding which we have dealt with, the micro foundation, where if the government spending itself is bad, or in the liberal economy or a self-righteous individuals spending behavior, the sort of spending by a third party is not necessary. So this is actually not in tune with what economic theory says, or the micro behavior of an economic agent framework says. It is actually something to do with the larger real context of the existence of the government as well as their spending pattern in that sense. So what we try to understand is that, over the time, if you explore or sort of understand the very nature of any sort of government or their spending, you would see this kind of graph. This is an example from Europe. So this is the total spending in the in the European countries, expenditure of the central government, GDP in that sense. So look at their public expenditure of the GDP. So the percentage of GDP in public expenditure over the period is, this is actually not the European system. This is Indian tax. This is Indian tax. Another slide is on Europe. This is Indian data. So in this data, we have almost a constant increase, or you say that a 10% of the expenditure, public expenditure of GDP is always ensured. That is, at least 10% of the total income is being spent. Now, total public expenditure, the government is also increasing enormously. That is, if you look into the 19 or the post 1991, though we see that actually the government intervention had come down or has to come down, and we have to open it up to this market. and all. But look at the data. It tells us a very different story. That is, the government's spending in that census has increased enormously. And of course, this is also true with the fact that the income of this revenue expend that is revenue of the state is also gone up very sharply during that period. In that sense, if you look at from 19 in the post 1990s onwards, there is a sharp increase in, except a few years, shocks and all. But the trend shows that there is an upward mobility of the revenue, and this is also positive with the understanding that the state is actually increasingly developing in that sense, because the growth of the GDP is very fast over this particular time frame, that is from since 1991. That itself, validates the earlier point of Wiesmann and Peacock, as well as the Wagners law, that when the state develops over a period, of course, its public expenditure is also going to be increasing. But this increasing rate is much faster than what we expected. Now, coming back to the second point, which was highlighted by Peacock and Wiesmann, let us look into the data on defense expenditure. Now, this is actually the defense budgets in from 2007 to 2016. Okay. Now, the reason here I am unable to add, but anyway, you can also look. There is also a positive trend in the recent 2 3 years also. So, that is when the capital expenditure, if you look into the capital expenditure to the defense is also increasing, as well as the revenue expenditure. That the total expenditure, if you combine it, and the total expenditure is showing a very positive, a steady growth in the in terms of the expenditure of this. Understanding India's defense spending in that sense is India has third largest armed forces in the world in terms of active personnel, and eighth largest spender of defense. India has been spending more on defense in the last 20 years, but so has the rest of the world. Again, every country is doing the same. So now we have border conflict between China. See, look at the Chinese spending in that sense. When you compare with China, our spending is much less than what China is spending on. So China is spending, at least in the last 20 years or 15 years, considerably a very, very large amount in the defense sector. So Chinese expenditure is actually increasing at a very, very high rate in that sense, or in terms of the value of currency also, it had increased many fold of what it was spent in 1990s. Which, when you compare that with the current situation, maybe it's 10 times increased. Then again, you see that the countries like Russia, India, and many countries are actually having an increase, especially the developing countries. Or Russia is an exception, but still, because of their dissolution and all, there is a considerable fall in their income, because of their income had fallen. That in fact reduced their spending, and then after 1998, when they started, the Russian economy was again integrated, as well as started picking up from 1998 onwards, 2000, all the post 1998 situation, Boris Yeltsin's period and all, and then the spending is also picked up. So this is exactly what Wagner as well as Peacock said, that when it is also not only the development of the state depends, but the spending depends, but also it is also in connection with what is actually their revenue collection. So this is in true with the Russian context, and we can keep extending this to a principle which is a very, very valid principle as far as the whole public expenditure principles are concerned. Now, there are other mechanisms also why this sort of an increase takes place. Okay, so there are many people had paint on different aspect of it, and Musgrave and Rostow's development models are very most very familiar if you have done development economics, and either of their theory you have studied. So the economist Musgrave and the economic historian Rostow separately suggested that the growth of the public expenditure might be related to the pattern of economic growth and development in society. Three stages in the development process could be distinguished at the early development stage, where considerable expenditure is required on education and on the infrastructure of the economy, also known as social overhead capital, and where private saving is inadequate to finance this necessary expenditure. In this stage, government expenditure must be a high proportion of the total output. This was actually the case with the Indian context earlier. Now, the situation is going to be slightly tilting because now many private, capitalists or the people who have capital is now even very bigger than what we thought a couple of years or decades back, because now many private party can come in and in the defense expenditure, especially when defense is very profitable business. And in the United States, most of the business, especially the armed services, as well as this industry, is controlled by a few corporates. So the phase of rapid growth in which there are large increase in private saving and public investment falls proportionately, and a high income society with increased demand for private good which need complementary public investment. So example, the motor car and urbanization in that sense. So there is always a sort of the prioritization in this case. Social overhead capital plays a very crucial role, as Rosto said. So the increasing need in high income society for skilled labor leads education to become increasingly an investment good for society as a whole. Increased population movement need to the development of urban slums. Such factors and other lead once again to increase in public expenditure in relation to total output. So this is a kind of a circular working, or kind of a relationship of the spending as well as the increasing income. So now the priority of different countries, especially when it is comes to the developing as well as the distinguish or distinguishable difference of developing and developed countries, though this classification is an age-old one. The country which is an aspiring or emerging, as well as the country which is already leaders of many of this production. That is the only thing which we can in a progressive sense distinguish. So the already the leading countries such as the United States in terms of industrial output, or in terms of imports, etc., their taxable income is much higher than what is the developing country too. So again, if you look into any Scandinavian countries, so their income is much, the collection, revenue collection is much higher. Therefore, their spending is also very higher on the social security sectors, because they develop, as we pointed here, when the country become a leading country, their aspiration is completely different to that of a country which is an emerging one. So a leading country requires more on education, health, and other aspects. When you compare with the other country, of course, the other country also requires that, but their priority is to basically, it's changes like industrialization, agricultural stabilization, etc. So their interest in that sense is actually varies based on their need. So these views are interesting in relation to theories of growth and development, but are rather too general to provide much of guides to recent experience in developing industrial countries. Now, this is again gives way to the different developmental theories, such as another theory, such as the critical limit hypothesis, rose to, right? So another hypothesis known as the critical limit hypothesis and concerned with the tolerance level of taxation was initiated by British economist, sorry, British economist Colin Clark immediately after the World War. So this is what is called the critical limit hypothesis, and the analysis of the empirical data of several Western countries for the interwar period results in critical limit hypothesis that when the government sector taxes and other receipts exceeds 25% of the aggregate economic activity, inflation necessarily arise even when the budget is balanced. Clark says, Clark laid down that when government tax system extricates increasing proportion of additional income from taxpayers whose incentives are harmed and whose productivity falls, People become less resistant to the inflationary method of government financing, while the aggregate demand expands as a result of inflationary financing technique. Aggregate supply falls due to the loss of incentive and hence inflation results. This is what is actually in the post-war example of a kind of the economy leading towards or led towards stagflation argument. But not many people had actually completely subscribed, but still it is a valid point as far as the theory is concerned. So, as the hypothesis based on institutional factor like the tolerance level of taxation, it resembles a displacement effect in that sense. So, a quite other aspect, the two hypotheses are quite different in that sense. Whereas this hypothesis has received very little support from academic circle, it has received popular support from the business circle, but not from the academic circle in that sense. Recent decades, however, proved that many countries have crossed the 25% limit without much inflationary tendency. So this is empirically, this is not necessarily a hardcore understanding, but of course there are country-specific examples which we can say that this also follows. Because of the high rate of inflation in some point of many Latin American and in many developing countries, in fact, caused by the excessive spending in that. So, country-specific kind of examples, which we can say, doesn't mean that that is the only theory or the explanation of what is happening in countries. But these are actually a good overview of different things which is happens in the economy. So the classical versus the Keynesian understanding is another kind of information which is as far as the expenditure of the state is concerned. The classical economists believe that government intervention brings more harm than good to an economy, and that the private sector should carry out most of the activity. So this is, and we should know that the time which is the classical economists were being leading. Now, this was actually the period where the East India Company or the British, the Holland, that is the Dutch East India Company, or many other the private kind of companies were been leading the business. So they were funding all research and development activities. So the natural bias of the economists also in that line. And the classical economists all believe that you have to let alone, but that was being questioned in the post, at least in the post economic crisis situation of 1930s depression period, and this was the dawn of the Keynesian revolution, or we used to say. So in the Wealth of Nation, Adam Smith advocated much of the laissez-faire economy where the profit motive was to be able to main cause of economic development. But again, we should know that actually the origin of the seafares or trade is not necessarily pure profit. See, when Constantinople was actually being closed and the trade was monopoly of some segment, I think the Turks, then actually the Europe was deprived of the resource. So that itself is actually one of the reason of their relentless voyage they were conducted, and that is one reason, not necessarily always profit. This argument often been questioned, but still after that it has always been profit, and profit is a driving factor. But at the same time, in the 1800s and in the late 1700s, that is in 18th century, 19th century, the whale hunting and all was the biggest industry as far as the fishing industry is concerned. So there are thousands of people died for finding of this fortune. uh, it is, people say that it is only profit, but of course it is profit, but the point is that there are other aspects also of life which has made many people join with this one venture of actually killing yourself. So I think there are the societal understanding is much complex than simply profit motive alone. But of course, as our primary concern is profit motive, we stick upon this aspect of profit motive. So uh, then the question is that then why should the government act in that sense? So we had already seen many counterpoints in this regard, and according to the classical economy, An increase in the total amount of money leads to an appropriate proportionate increase in all money prices with no change in the allocation of resources or the level of real GDP, which is known as money neutrality. So the classical economists assumed that the economy was perfect. It is always at full employment level, wage rate and rate of interest is self-adjusted, and as a matter of fact, the budget should always balance as saving is always equal to investment. So since they believe that the economy was always at its full employment level, their objective was certainly not growth in that sense. So the following 1930 depression, as I pointed earlier, that the classical economists that opposed government intervention argued that the strong trade union prevented wage flexibility. Now, what they said is actually because of the wage union or the labor union. But the problem is that the labor union itself is actually being emerged after a relentless struggle of many decades. So the classical economists that opposed government intervention argued that the strong trade union prevented wage flexibility, which resulted in high unemployment. The Keynesians, on the other hand, favored government intervention to correct market failures. So in 1936, John Maynard Keynes' general theory of employment interest criticized the classical economists to put too much emphasis on the long run. So according to Keynes, we are all dead in long run. So this is a very classic statement of Keynes. So he said Keynes believed that depression need government intervention as a short-term cure. Increasing saving will not help, but spending. Government will increase public spending, giving individuals purchasing power and procedure producers will produce more, creating more employment. This is multiplier effect that shows causality from public expenditure to national income. This is quite a convincing way of actually putting it up. Now we are at the midst of a pandemic where we should know that the importance of the government, which people are trying to speak on. Now everywhere that the importance of the government is coming up, why government is actually a sort of a mechanism which is actually reflects the will of every individual. It is not particularly some people's interest, but it is actually try to protect the general interest of the public which it represents. Therefore the importance of the government is very very essential in that sense, and their role being also highlighted in that sense, because now when you take case of the interventionist policies of the state in different states including China and India, in Kerala, etc., and all people were talks about the very importance of the government and its effective intervention in this sort of an activity. But you can't simply have a government out of a blue. Okay, yeah, yeah, the functional mechanism the government is actually having a long lasting effect, or it is actually a time taking process to make an effective government in place. So therefore the importance of the government is not actually been ruled out in the Keynesian understanding. And of course the Keynesian system, the expenditure is actually a driving force, especially the government led expenditure, which we call the fiscal policy. So that is a driving factor for the development of that particular state when it is actually face any sort of a crisis. So in that sense the importance of the government is inevitable, as well as showed that positive when you talk about the development or the growth of the state. So when we speak about the development of the state, then the increasing role of the government cannot be moved, uh, cannot be actually put aside. So that is why we see all this proposition says that the role of government is very crucial as far as the development of the state is concerned, and vice versa as far as the public expenditure theories are concerned. So with this, let me conclude this speech and the lecture, and I'll invite your question if any. So that's all.